Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to tackle a question that is absolutely everywhere. It completely dominates our modern political headlines, our news cycles, our dinner table arguments. Was globalization good or was it bad for workers? Now, if you spend any amount of time watching the news or listening to political debates, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. People are constantly trying to compress globalization into one simple, neat, moral sentence. It's usually framed as either the ultimate economic savior of humanity or an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe for the working class. But you know what? The honest answer, the one that is actually backed by the hard evidence of 50 different countries over 30 years, is that globalization was genuinely good for some workers, it was devastatingly bad for others, and it is entirely impossible to compress into a single moral sentence without, well, lying just a little bit. It's complicated, but it's a fascinating story. Let's unpack it.
Right off the bat, we've got to look at this stark contrast, because this juxtaposition is the core of the entire debate. On one side, we have the lived reality of the United States. We're talking about manufacturing employment dropping by a staggering 6.7 million jobs between its peak in 1979 and 2019. That is a massive chunk of the workforce. But look at the other side. During that exact same era, China utilized deeper integration with the global economy to lift nearly 800 million people out of extreme poverty. Now here's the wild part. Both of these stories are true at the exact same time. This split, this is the whole drama. This is exactly why the debate over globalization never, ever dies. You literally cannot look at just one side of the split and understand the whole picture. You have to hold both of these realities in your head at once.
To truly wrap our heads around this, we need to break it down region by region. Section 1, the industrial heartlands.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about in the West. The Bureau of Labor Statistics documented what can only be described as a brutal decline. We're looking at manufacturing employment peaking at about 19.6 million back in 1979, and then falling to 12.8 million by June 2019. But guys, we have to remember that behind these numbers are real towns, real families, and real people. The absolute critical detail here is that after every single recession since 1979, those industrial jobs, they never came back to their previous level. Now, to be perfectly fair to the data, it's important to note that trade alone didn't cause every single one of those lost jobs. Automation, huge leaps in productivity growth, and changing consumer habits, they all played massive roles too. But the data shows us something undeniable. Industrial employment, at least in the old sense of the word, wasn't just temporarily displaced, it was structurally reduced. The world fundamentally changed for these workers, and the floor kind of fell out from under them.
Now, if we jump across the Atlantic, a remarkably similar story unfolded. Data from the UK House of Commons Library shows manufacturing's share of the entire British economy plummeting from 17% in 1990 down to just 9% recently. Meanwhile, the services sector just absolutely exploded, rising to dominate a whopping 80% of the economy. Now, let's be clear, this doesn't mean Britain inherently failed because of globalization, but its economic DNA fundamentally mutated. And here is where perception becomes reality, which is so important in politics. For the consumers, the rising tech firms, the finance sector, and really everyone in that booming 80% services sector, this shift looked exactly like modernization. It looked like progress. But for the workers who were attached to the old industrial model, this structural change felt like complete and total abandonment.
When economists dig into the data and study the sudden influx of global imports, what they call the trade shock, a really bitter reality emerges. The pain was hyperlocal. Import competition caused employment and wage losses that were heavily concentrated in very specific exposed industries and highly specific local labor markets. Entire towns relied on one or two factories. Meanwhile, the gains from that trade, things like lower prices for everyday household goods, those were spread out across everyone in the country. For workers in rich countries, this local reality often meant incredibly intense competition, sudden factory closures that came out of nowhere, and severe, prolonged wage pressure. And frankly, we have to acknowledge the deep emotional toll here. I mean, imagine the sheer humiliation of losing your livelihood, your career, your identity, only to have some politician tell you that you should actually be happy because, hey, flat-screen TVs and t-shirts are cheaper at the local superstore now. The costs were hyper-local. The benefits were broad and diffuse. That formula right there, that is politically explosive.
But we have to turn the page to a side of the story that often gets completely flattened or ignored in Western debates. Section 2. The development ladder.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of it. 800 million.
That is an unprecedented, staggering number. To put that into perspective, the World Bank notes that since China began its reform and opening up back in 1978, their GDP growth averaged over 9% a year. That sustained growth lifted almost 800 million people out of extreme poverty, and they officially eradicated extreme poverty there by 2020. For them, access to world markets was a ladder. It was the first real shot at rising incomes and industrial upgrading for millions and millions of families. But, and this is a big but, the World Bank also points out that the ladder is pretty uneven. Even in 2024, 15.2% of China's population still lived on less than $8.30 a day. So it reminds us that while the first phase of development, the part driven by market integration and basic manufacturing, is historically massive, the next phase of development is always much harder.
If you want to see the pro-globalization argument in its absolute sharpest, most undeniable form, look at Vietnam. The World Bank literally calls it a remarkable development success story, and the numbers back that up completely. Following the Doi Moi reforms in 1986, Vietnam completely transformed. It went from being one of the world's poorest countries into a highly dynamic middle-income economy. Just watch how the GDP per capita rockets up from under $700 in 1986 to nearly $4,500 today. And while that was happening, extreme poverty virtually vanished, falling from 14% to under 4% in just over a decade. Today, Vietnam is one of the most open economies on planet Earth, boasting a trade-to-GDP ratio near 170%. Vietnam absolutely proves that export-led growth, tapping into foreign demand, and incredible life-changing poverty reduction can be completely inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other.
So how do economists reconcile these two worlds, the regional collapse in the West and the miraculous poverty reduction in the East? Section 3, Macro Gains, Micro Pain.
The most serious empirical work out there refuses to pick a simplistic side. A really comprehensive working paper from the International Monetary Fund looked at a massive data set and concluded that the effects of trade are heterogeneous. Now, that's just a fancy academic way of saying it depends. It's a mixed bag. The paper actually found limited adverse impact from import competition on average. In fact, in some countries and some industries, import competition actually strengthened employment growth. It improved average wages, boosted investment, and increased firm profitability because they were forced to innovate. But the IMF is very careful to note that this definitely does not mean there are no losers. The final outcome completely depends on the specific firm, the specific worker, the country they live in, and especially the educational attainment in the government policy environment surrounding them.
And this brings us to a massive paradox in the global economic literature. It's like looking at a giant puzzle. Macro studies, the ones looking from a bird's-eye view, often find that trade openness raises aggregate growth without worsening inequality across the whole economy. The overall pie gets bigger. But micro studies, the ones looking at the ground level, show that exposed workers and local communities suffer sharp, extremely localized losses. The exact same global trade shock can lower employment in an exposed firm, while driving higher sales, massive wage growth, and new investment in another context entirely. This split between the big picture averages where everything looks fine and the on-the-ground reality where things might be falling apart is the exact reason the political debates you see on TV every night remain so incredibly toxic and durable. People are literally talking past each other using two different sets of true facts.
So the crucial point here is understanding what I call the timing problem. Just look at the pacing here. The gains from globalization, they arrive like a slow crawl. We're talking incremental drops in prices, steady, invisible bumps in productivity, and eventually higher average income spread over years or even decades. You barely notice it day to day. But the losses? They strike like lightning. A massive manufacturing plant closes overnight. A union local is broken in a matter of weeks. A town is hollowed out almost instantly. Or a worker is suddenly forced into a much lower-paid service job, having to watch their family's social status evaporate right before their eyes. This emotional asymmetry is exactly why a policy can be entirely efficient on paper, mathematically, economically rational, and yet completely ruinous in lived experience. Both things are true, and they exist without contradiction.
Recognizing both those massive gains and those severe localized pains, where do we actually go from here? Section 4, the policy reality. Let's move to our next point and see how this builds, because it is incredibly tempting to think protectionism, just throwing up tariffs and closing the borders, is a clean rescue. But the World Trade Organization states bluntly that trade protectionism neither protects the overall economy nor does it promote inclusiveness. And the World Bank notes that progress on poverty has actually stalled recently amid low growth and global fragmentation. The WTO makes it crystal clear. Trade policies absolutely must be complemented by labor, education, and competition policies. So the choice we're facing isn't globalization versus safety. The true choice is open markets plus compensation versus closed markets plus self-inflicted inefficiency. Honestly, workers are entirely justified in their anger when the open markets are enthusiastically delivered by their leaders, but the compensation, the retraining, and the social protections are completely forgotten.
If we strip away all the toxic politics and the shouting matches, the evidence leaves us with this unavoidable, impartial conclusion. Globalization was a gigantic redistribution machine. It was not a universal blessing, and it was not a universal scam. The anti-globalization camp, they point to manufacturing decline, job insecurity, and outsourced pain. And they are right. The pro-globalization camp, they point to hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty and amazing access to global markets. And they are right too. Every camp has a real, legitimate grievance, and every camp has real data to back it up. The evidence simply refuses to let us erase the losers just so we can celebrate the winners, or erase the winners so we can mourn the losers. Globalization redistributed jobs, wages, power, prices, and bargaining leverage across countries and deeply within them.
It made some workers much richer, it made some workers poorer, and it made millions of consumers better off. It built up East Asia into an economic powerhouse, and it hollowed out parts of the US and UK industrial heartlands. The story is just not as simple as good or bad. So the real question, the only one that actually matches the complex reality of the data we've looked at today, is this: who got the shock? Who got the gains? And did any government actually bother to smooth the landing for the people caught in the middle? Think about that the next time you read the headlines. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.